My Last Duchess by Robert Browning is a clever and disturbing dramatic monologue written in the voice of the powerful and domineering Duke of Ferrara, an obsessive and controlling man who shows a visitor, as well as us the readers, a painting of his last wife. At first, it seems that the Duke's polite manners and descriptions of his deceased wife are harmless. However, as the poem develops, it becomes clear to the reader that there is something far more sinister behind the story he is telling. This video will analyse the meanings and literary methods of the poem, primarily for the AQA GCSE English Power and Conflict Poetry Anthology. If you want to watch my illustrated reading of the poem, or view my other content, click the link at the end and subscribe to my channel, Comics and Lit. Before we read the poem, I'll quickly summarise some key context surrounding Robert Browning, which will help us understand his motivations for writing the poem, and therefore allow us to explore meanings in greater depth. Browning was born in London in 1812 and is one of the most well-regarded of the Victorian poets. Browning was liberally minded for his time and supported the emancipation or freedom of women, and additionally he opposed slavery. He married fellow poet Elizabeth Barrett in 1846, and the pair moved to Italy, where Browning would remain for the rest of his life. Browning was fascinated by the art and culture of Italy, and this certainly comes through in the poem My Last Duchess, which is inspired by the story of a Renaissance Duke, Alfonso II, and his brief marriage to Lucretia di Cosimo de' Medici, who died at the age of 17. Browning is particularly famed for his mastery of a poetic form called the dramatic monologue, a type of poetry which dramatises a narrator, who is not the poet themselves, delivering the entire speech of the poem in a conversational style, addressing one or more other individuals who do not speak. The main purpose of the dramatic monologue is to reveal the character of the narrator to the reader over the course of the poem. As I said earlier, My Last Duchess is based around the historical figure of Alfonso II and his marriage to Lucretia. Alfonso's family name of Este identifies him as part of a great and distinguished family of nobility, something which Browning will reference within the poem itself. While Lucretia's family, the Medicis, were fabulously rich, they were considered to be new money, and thus of lower status than the family of the Duke. When Lucretia died, there were rumours that she had been poisoned by the Duke, though this was never confirmed, and could well have been a rumour spread by the Duke's rivals in order to discredit him. I will now show the illustrated reading of the poem. As you watch and listen, pay attention to the poem's very controlled rhythm and structure. It is written as one long verse in iambic pentameter, with 10 syllables per line, in alternating unstressed and stressed syllables. It is also written entirely in rhyming couplets, which creates a strong sense of repetition and control over the tone of the poem. Additionally, pay attention for the signs of the Duke's displeasure at the Duchess. Why did he dislike her? And at what point does he reveal the possibility that her death was not of natural causes? That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one. My favour at her breast? The dropping of the daylight in the west? The bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her? The white mule she rode with round the terrace? All and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush, at least. She thanked men. Good. But thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even if you had skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. Will it please you rise? We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Now you have listened to the poem being read, hopefully you noticed how the form of the dramatic monologue creates an intimate and personal feel to the poem. We, the reader, imagine ourselves in the role of the Duke's guest, listening carefully to his thoughts and feelings about the Duchess. You may also have noticed the tone of the Duke becoming more malevolent and controlling as the poem moves towards the end. While the Duke begins the poem simply asking us to admire the painting of the Duchess, as his monologue continues, we are slowly made aware of the Duke's displeasure and frustration at his wife's conduct. Before we look more closely at the language and structure of the poem, let's consider the dominant themes Browning explored. Firstly, the objectification of women. Objectification means to treat or degrade an individual, in this case a woman, by considering them merely as an object or thing, rather than a human being. The Duchess is objectified both in the painting itself, which the Duke obsessively controls. He hides the Duchess's image behind a curtain, stating that none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. Another key theme in the poem is the power of hierarchy, basically the ability of people with high status in society to control those they think are beneath them. The Duke, who obsesses over the status of his 900 years old name, seems to believe that his wealth and social status gives him the right to be feared and respected, especially by the Duchess. Finally, Browning clearly explores the theme of gender and male control over women, as the Duke again, by right of his gender, believes he has the right to command and control the Duchess. The poem itself is Victorian and therefore predates the feminist movement. However, by highlighting the Duke's self-obsession and controlling nature, Browning certainly criticises the cruelty of his male speaker and creates sympathy for the Duchess and her role as a woman being controlled by an obsessive husband. I will now focus on some structural analysis of the poem. In poetry, like novels, structure is the organisational techniques a writer uses to create an engaging and satisfying narrative. The first key structural method used in the poem is the metre. Browning uses iambic pentameter throughout the poem, which is the controlled heartbeat rhythm of 10-syllable lines, with every second syllable stressed. Listen to these lines as an example. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said frappand of by design, for never read. Can you hear the steady and controlled rhythm it creates? Iambic pentameter is often said to mimic the natural tempo or cadence of human speech, so Browning uses it to create a natural and relaxed flow to the Duke's speech, which highlights the Duke's comfort and confidence in his company. However, this structural use of controlled meter is contrasted by Browning's use of enjambment, which is where sentences within a poem flow over into the following lines without punctuation. Listen to the way this section of the poem sounds. "Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek." Due to the omission of punctuation, the reading has a fast-flowing and almost breathless quality, which seems to fight against the order or control implied by the iambic pentameter. We can analyse this as Browning deliberately creating a discord or tension within the structure of the poem that hints at the Duke's inability to control the Duchess, or even his own emotions. This sense of the Duke's lack of self-control is also highlighted by Browning's use of caesura throughout the poem. Look at these two examples from the middle of the poem, where Browning uses punctuation to stop the flow of the narrative in the middle of a line. Consider the effect that these caesuras have on the impact of certain words. "In then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her. But who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together." You should be able to hear the caesuras breaking up the rhythm of the poem. Additionally, Browning breaks the meter here from the iambic pentameter, which creates a more jarring and uneasy tone. Notably, this is the moment the Duke reveals the dark truth behind the Duchess's absence. The simple sentence, "I gave commands," all but reveals that his jealousy and possessiveness drove him to have the Duchess murdered. So as the disturbing climax of the poem is reached, Browning breaks up the rhythm to mimic the anger of the Duke and to draw our attention to the violence which is caused by the Duke's nature. Browning masterfully structures the poem to slowly reveal the Duke's obsessive and controlling nature, and it draws to a close with the revelation that the visitor the Duke is speaking with is an envoy from a count whose daughter the Duke intends to marry. The line, "Though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object." The line again employs caesura after the word object, which forces us to pause mid-flow and recognise the disturbing truth that the Duke does not see women as anything more than an accessory to his powerful position. His labelling of his prospective partner as an object also suggests he sees marriage as a simple transaction of ownership. To him, his new wife is really just a possession. As a result, we are left wondering of the terrible fate which may await the next Duchess if she displeases the Duke. In many ways, it does prove most effective to analyse the poem in terms of structure, since the clear and intentional use of techniques such as meter, enjambment and caesura provide a lot of depth of analysis. However, there are some useful aspects of language to explore as well. The most straightforward language methods Browning uses in the poem are tone, questions, and symbolism. Since much of the poem mimics natural speech, it is helpful to consider the subtle controlling language the Duke uses, which contrasts with his seemingly polite tone. Look at this example from early in the poem. After introducing the painting, the Duke politely instructs the visitor to sit and admire the painting with the line, "Will it please you sit and look at her?" Interestingly, Browning uses a question. However, the use of the modal verb will, which carries a more instructive, command-like quality than, for instance, would or could, suggests that the Duke is really giving an instruction which his guest must follow. Through this clever use of language, the Duke's controlling nature is hinted at. He is polite and well-mannered, yet clearly offers the guest no choice but to do as he says. So Browning presents him as a manipulative and controlling from the very start through his language. This technique is repeated later on in the poem as the Duke again offers a command masked by a question. "Will it please you rise?" It seems as though he is a puppet master, directing his guest to follow his instructions while still representing himself as polite and considerate as a host. There are also two significant examples of symbolism in the poem. The first is of course the painting of the Duchess itself. Introduced in the very opening of the poem, the painting can be seen as a symbol of the Duke's attitude to women. He sees women as objects to be possessed, rather than people deserving of respect. The painting of the Duchess sits in his collection, hidden by a curtain, which he says, "None puts by but I." The curtain then is also symbolic of the Duke's controlling nature. He is so obsessive over the image of the Duchess, he even controls who can view it. The symbol of the painting therefore represents the Duke's own self-importance and vanity. It is also somewhat ironic, since he seems to take such pleasure in revealing it and bragging about the beauty of the painting, yet he clearly despised the Duchess when she was alive, which is emphasised by the furious tone in his comments on her smile, that he complains, "went everywhere," when she was alive. Browning also ends the poem with another symbol of the Duke's controlling nature. As he ushers his guest downstairs to meet the others, he brags, "Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse. Thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me." Neptune is the Roman god of the sea, and thus can be seen as a symbol of power and dominance. So the statue is a symbol of the Duke's self-image. He sees himself as a god, able to tame and control anything around him. He could not control the Duchess while she was alive, but through his privilege and status, he was able to have her killed, and now controls her image. By the end of the poem, the reader is in no doubt that he will impose his power over his new wife, and we as readers are chilled by the thought of what may happen if she displeases him. If you're looking to compare this poem with others in the collection, the theme of hierarchy matches well with Ozymandias. Clear similarities can be drawn between the Duke's power and authority and the king in Ozymandias, as well as Browning and Shelley's critical treatment of their subjects. My Last Duchess also compares well with Kamikaze, a poem which deals with the negative result of the power and control of those in authority. Consider how both the Duchess and the pilot are both subject to the control of their superiors. Additionally, it can also be compared with London, or Extract from the Prelude, since both these poems deal with the idea of human power. In London, the suffering caused by the ignorance of the wealthy, and in Extract from the Prelude, the attempts by the poet to impose his will on nature. If you enjoyed this analysis, please support me by liking this video and clicking on the link to subscribe to my channel for more poetry revision content.